For 10 long years, my husband told the entire neighborhood that my career was a pathetic joke. He stood in front of our friends and threw my life's work into the garbage just to get a laugh. He thought he was putting a foolish wife in her place. But when the $200 million buyout landed in my inbox 3 minutes later, everything changed. He wanted my success. He got the divorce papers instead. Laughter echoed through the dining room of our 4,000 square foot suburban home. The crystal wine glasses chimed as David poured another round of overpriced Cabernet for his colleagues. I sat at the edge of the mahogany table, gripping my linen napkin. My chest tightened with familiar, creeping dread. David was in his element. He wore his expensive tailored suit and a smug smile that always preceded a punchline at my expense. Our guests leaned in. They were mostly finance executives and their perfectly styled wives. I was the odd one out. A formulation chemist who spent her days in the converted garage mixing compounds while wearing a stained lab coat. I tried to focus on my roasted asparagus. I prayed David would stick to bragging about his latest golf handicap or luxury car, but the wine was flowing and he needed a new target. His eyes locked onto me across the table. A cruel twinkle sparked in his gaze. "You all have to hear about Sarah's little science fair project," David announced. His voice boomed over the soft jazz playing in the background. The table went quiet. All eyes turned to me. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. "David, please," I whispered. I kept my voice low, hoping to diffuse the situation. "Not tonight," but he ignored me completely. "Oh, come on, honey, tell them," he insisted with fake encouragement. "Sarah has been out in the garage for a decade playing with expensive slime." A few guests chuckled nervously. David fed on their reaction. "She calls it a revolutionary, biodegradable medical adhesive. I call it a money pit. Do you know how much she spent on a centrifuge last month? Enough to buy a small boat." The laughter grew louder. My stomach turned into a hard knot. I had poured my soul into that formula. It was a groundbreaking polymer designed to suture internal wounds without scarring. It was real science that could save lives. But to David, it was just a hobby keeping me from being a proper corporate wife. I took a deep breath and forced a tight smile. I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing me cry. "It is actually in the final testing phase," I said clearly. I tried to maintain my dignity, but David was not finished. He stood up from his chair. He walked over to the side table where I had carelessly left my briefcase after coming in from the lab. He popped the latch and pulled out a small glass vial containing my latest prototype. "Final testing phase?" David mocked loudly. He held the vial up to the chandelier light like it was a cheap toy. "Looks like something you buy at a dollar store. 10 years of our lives and thousands of my dollars for this garbage." "Geisha now." "Buy it." Before I could even stand up or say a word, he walked over to the kitchen trash can at the edge of the open dining area. He looked right into my eyes. Then he dropped the glass vial straight into the garbage. The thud of it hitting the bottom echoed in my ears. The guests gasped in shocked amusement. I did not scream. I did not throw my wine in his face. I stood up slowly. I kept my posture perfectly straight. "Excuse me," I said with a terrifying calmness. I turned my back on the dining room and walked into the kitchen. The sounds of David laughing with his friends faded behind me. I knelt next to the trash can. My hands were shaking. I reached in and pulled out the vial. The glass was thankfully intact. I gripped it tightly, feeling the cool surface against my skin. I needed a moment to breathe. I leaned against the marble countertop and pulled my phone from my pocket just to have something to stare at. The screen lit up with a new email notification. It was from the lead acquisition director at Apex Biotech. My heart skipped a beat as I opened the message. There were no pleasantries, just a single PDF attachment labeled Term Sheet Final. I tapped the file. The document loaded on my small screen. My eyes scanned the legal jargon until they locked onto a bolded number at the bottom of the first page. $200 million. I stopped breathing and read it again. It was a formal binding offer to buy my biodegradable adhesive formula in its entirety. They wanted full ownership of the patent, and they were willing to pay $250 million for it. The humiliation evaporated instantly. The pain of David mocking my decade of hard work vanished. An icy clarity washed over me. I looked toward the dining room where my husband was still holding court and making jokes at my expense. He had just thrown a $200 million invention into the garbage. He had spent 10 years financially suffocating me and verbally abusing my dreams. He thought he had all the power. He thought I was trapped. I slipped the vial into my pocket. I locked my phone and slid it away. The game had just changed completely. The immediate problem was no longer my bruised ego or a ruined dinner party. The problem was keeping this massive secret from the man 50 feet away until I could protect myself. I had to secure all the money. I was going to need a ruthless lawyer. I called Maya, my African-American sister-in-law, right away. The morning sun glared through the kitchen windows, but the house felt freezing cold. I stood by the coffee maker staring at the black liquid. I had not slept a single minute. The $200 million term sheet burned in my mind all night. I heard heavy footsteps coming down the stairs. David marched into the kitchen wearing his expensive running gear. His face was twisted in a familiar scowl. He did not say good morning. He slammed his shaker onto the counter. He glared at me with absolute disgust over last night. Not because he humiliated me, but because I walked away and refused to play the obedient wife. He told me I embarrassed him. He said my little stunt made him look bad. I stayed completely silent. I just kept my eyes on the coffee pot. My silence only made him angrier. He leaned across the counter and pointed his finger at my face. He told me the free ride was over. He said 10 years of financing my delusional hobbies ended today. He gave me exactly 48 hours to find a real job. If I did not have an offer by Monday morning, he was gutting the garage. He told me he was throwing every beaker into a dumpster and turning my lab into a home gym. I just nodded slowly. I poured my coffee and walked past him without a word. I went to my home office and locked the door. I logged into our joint banking portal. A bright red error message flashed across the screen. Access denied. I tried my credit card app. The account was locked. David had woken up early and severed my financial access. He drained our joint checking account and moved every penny into an individual account in his name. He cancelled my cards and blocked my debit PIN. I was financially paralyzed. A cold sweat broke out on my neck. I opened the email from Apex Biotech again. The instructions were very clear. I had to be in their Manhattan office by tomorrow morning to sign the preliminary non-disclosure agreement and initiate the due diligence phase. If I failed to show up, the $200 million offer was gone instantly. I needed a last-minute flight from Chicago to New York. I needed a hotel and a cab to their corporate headquarters. I had absolutely zero money to my name. I could not buy a cup of coffee, let alone a plane ticket. David thought he was punishing me. He had no idea he was sabotaging a fortune. But the reality set in fast. If I asked David for money, he would demand to know why. If I told him about the buyout, he would claim the money belonged to him because he funded the lab. He would take over the negotiations and ruin everything. I was completely trapped. I sat at my desk and forced myself to breathe. I needed cash immediately and someone I could trust implicitly. I pulled out my phone and scrolled past our mutual friends. None of them would help me. They all worshipped David and his high-paying executive job. I stopped at one name, Maya. She was my older brother's wife. Maya was a brilliant African-American corporate attorney working at one of the most ruthless law firms in the city. She was always highly intimidating. She wore designer suits and destroyed opposing counsel for sport. David absolutely hated her because she never laughed at his jokes and never backed down from his arrogant arguments. Maya saw right through him from day one. I hit the call button and pressed the phone to my ear. My hand was shaking so badly, I almost dropped the device. Maya answered on the second ring. Her voice was sharp and professional. I did not waste time with small talk. I told her David locked me out of the accounts. I heard her sigh heavily. She told me she was not surprised and asked if I was safe. I told her I was fine physically, but I was in desperate trouble. I explained that I needed to be in New York by tomorrow morning for the most important meeting of my life, and I had no way to get there. Maya went completely quiet. She asked what kind of meeting required me to flee to New York in secret. I took a deep breath and told her the truth. I told her about the $200 million offer from Apex Biotech for my medical adhesive. There was a long, stunning silence. Then I heard Maya let out a low whistle. Her tone shifted instantly from concerned sister-in-law to a predatory corporate lawyer smelling blood in the water. She asked exactly what David knew. I told her he knew nothing. I told her he threw my prototype in the garbage last night and threatened to destroy my lab this morning. Maya told me to listen closely. She said David freezing the accounts was actually the greatest gift he could have ever given me. By cutting me off, he established a documented financial separation. But she warned me that the second the ink dried on that contract, David would unleash a war to steal half of it. I told her I knew that, and that is why I needed her help. I begged her to buy my plane ticket. I promised I would pay her back the second the deal closed. Maya laughed a dark, confident laugh. She told me she would buy the first-class ticket and book a luxury hotel suite, but she had one condition. She told me I was not going to New York alone. She was coming with me. Maya declared herself my official legal counsel effective immediately. She told me to pack a bag and meet her at the corner coffee shop right now. She said we had a plane to catch and a husband to destroy. I threw clothes into a carry-on bag and ran out. I met Maya at the corner just like she asked. She was waiting in a sleek black town car. When I slid into the seat, she handed me a burner phone. She told me to turn off my old phone completely so David could not track my location. Then she smiled a very dangerous smile. Maya explained her brilliant trap. Before picking me up, she had intentionally used my frozen joint credit card at a local travel agency. The transaction was obviously declined, but she knew the system and would immediately send a fraud alert to David with the exact location and the attempted purchase details. She wanted him to know I was buying a plane ticket. She wanted him to follow us to the airport. I stared at her in total shock. I asked her why in the world we would want my angry husband chasing us down. Maya just adjusted her designer sunglasses and told me that David was arrogant and predictable. She needed him to make a massive mistake on the public record, and anger was the best way to force his hand. The town car sped onto the highway toward the airport. My heart pounded against my ribs. We arrived at the terminal and stepped into the chaotic crowd. The glass doors opened and the noise washed over us. Maya walked with incredible purpose. I stayed close behind her, wheeling my small bag. We were 50 feet from the security checkpoint when I heard his voice. It cut through the terminal noise like a siren. He screamed my name. I froze in my tracks. I turned around and saw David sprinting past a row of check-in kiosks. His face was red and sweat poured down his forehead. He looked completely unhinged. He had clearly broken multiple traffic laws to beat us here. People stared as he stormed up and grabbed my arm so hard his fingers dug into my skin. He demanded to know where I thought I was going. He looked at Maya and then back to me with pure venom in his eyes. He yelled that I was a cheating liar spending his money to fund an affair in New York. The accusation was so absurd I could not even process it. I tried to pull my arm away, but his grip only tightened. A crowd formed around us. Travelers paused to record the drama. David loved an audience, and he played right to them. Raising his voice, he called me a pathetic housewife playing dress-up. He said I was running away because I could not face the reality of getting a real job. He demanded that I turn around and go back to my empty house right now. He told me if I got on that plane, I would never see his money again. I felt paralyzed by the public spectacle. I looked at the faces of the strangers watching us. Some looked pitying and others looked amused. David thought he was winning. He thought public shame would break me just like it always did at his dinner parties. He yanked my arm again, telling me the little vacation was over. But he had severely miscalculated. He was so focused on degrading me that he completely forgot who was standing right next to me. Maya stepped forward. She did not raise her voice. She did not look frantic. She looked like a predator that had just cornered its prey. She slapped his hand off my arm with incredible force. David stumbled back in shock. He opened his mouth to yell, but Maya cut him off instantly. She spoke with a cold, terrifying authority. She stated her title as a senior partner at a feared corporate litigation firm. She informed David she was my retained counsel and he was committing assault and battery in a federal jurisdiction. David tried to laugh it off, but his voice cracked. Maya pointed directly at the Transportation Security Administration officers who were now jogging toward our commotion. She told David he had exactly 5 seconds to turn around and walk away, or she would have him arrested for public harassment and domestic assault. She promised that by the time his car was towed, she would have a restraining order filed and his corporate reputation smeared across the evening news. The TSA officers arrived and asked if there was a problem. David looked at the officers and then looked at Maya. The color drained from his face completely. The arrogant executive bravado vanished. He realized he was inches away from being handcuffed on camera. He raised his hands in surrender and took a slow step backward. He nervously told the officers that everything was perfectly fine. He looked at me with absolute hatred, but did not dare step closer. He turned around and walked away through the crowd in total defeat. Maya guided me toward the security lane. We did not look back at him even once. While waiting in the line, Maya pulled out her phone and smiled. She showed me a digital filing alert from the courthouse. David was sitting in his car fuming with rage and spite. To punish me, he had immediately filed an emergency petition for legal separation. He requested an immediate freeze on all marital assets to ensure I could not touch his money while I was away. He thought he was trapping me in poverty and locking down his accounts. But Maya started laughing quietly. She told me David just signed his own death warrant. By legally establishing our separation at this exact hour, he had formally drawn a line in the sand. Any asset created or finalized after this very minute was entirely mine. He had just unknowingly surrendered all rights to the $200 million patent I was about to sign over in New York. The massive trap was set, and David had walked right into it. The turbulent morning flight to New York was a fast blur of pure adrenaline and absolute anxiety. When Maya and I stepped out of the cab in front of the Apex Biotech Tower, the sheer scale of the building took my breath away. It was a monolith of gleaming glass and steel cutting into the Manhattan skyline. For 10 long, exhausting years, I had worked on a cheap folding table in a dusty suburban garage, listening to my husband call me a pathetic failure. Now, I was walking through a polished granite lobby as a guest of honor. We rode the private elevator up to the executive floor in total silence. The doors opened to a sweeping boardroom overlooking the entire city. Standing at the end of a massive oak table was Richard Sterling, the chief executive officer of Apex Biotech. He did not look at me like I was a bored housewife playing with chemicals. He looked at me like I was the most valuable person in the world. He shook my hand firmly and told me my medical adhesive was the most elegant polymer structure his research division had ever seen. Hearing a billionaire validate a decade of my blood and sweat almost brought me to tears. But there was simply no time for emotions. Maya dropped her leather briefcase onto the table and told Richard we had a massive legal hurdle to clear before anyone signed a single page. Richard signaled his corporate legal team to enter the room. 4 sharp attorneys in dark gray suits sat down across from us. Maya did not blink. She reached into her briefcase and handed out printed copies of the digital court alert she received at the airport. She explained that my vindictive husband had officially filed for emergency legal separation exactly 2 hours ago. The Apex attorneys looked at the document and then looked at Maya with intense scrutiny. The lead attorney leaned forward and stated the obvious problem. He said that since I developed the primary formula during the marriage, David could legally lay claim to half of the $200 million. He said Apex Biotech would definitely not purchase contested intellectual property because they absolutely refused to be dragged into a messy suburban divorce battle. My heart sank into my stomach. I looked at the incredible view of the city and felt my entire life slipping away. David was absolutely going to win again. His petty, spiteful maneuver at the courthouse was going to cost me my life-changing fortune. But Maya just smiled that terrifying predator smile. She told the Apex lawyers they were looking at the timeline completely backward. She explained that David filing the separation papers before the term sheet was signed was not a problem at all. It was actually the ultimate legal loophole. Maya walked over to the whiteboard at the end of the room and grabbed a thick black marker. She drew a harsh line down the middle of the board. On the left side, she wrote the past 10 years. On the right side, she wrote today. She explained that under the exact legal statutes of my home state, any asset created after the timestamp on that emergency separation filing was entirely immune from marital division. The Apex lawyers pushed back immediately. They argued that the original formula was already created, so the timeline did not protect me. But Maya looked right at me and asked a brilliant question. She asked if it was possible to alter the chemical structure of the adhesive just enough to require a brand new patent filing without losing the medical efficacy. I stared at her silently as my mind raced through the periodic table and my years of meticulous lab data. I realized that by substituting a specific carbon chain, I could actually make the curing time slightly faster. It would be a completely new molecular entity. I nodded slowly and told them I could do it. Richard slammed his hand on the table in pure excitement. The Apex legal team rapidly agreed. They stated that if I could synthesize the new compound and patent it under a blind trust structured by Maya, then David would have absolutely zero legal claim to the $200 million. The money would be completely invisible forever and entirely mine. There was just one terrifying catch to this massive plan. To make the new patent legally binding, I had to actually physically synthesize the new chemical variation and document the entire process in my own lab. I could not just write it down on a piece of paper in New York. I had to go back to the exact garage my husband had threatened to destroy. I looked at my watch again. It was late afternoon already. David had given me 48 hours, but I knew his volatile temper better than anyone. The second he realized I was actually in New York and ignoring his demands, he would act out of spite. He would call the junk removal company early. He would change the locks on the house. I had to get back tonight. I had to break into my own home in the dead of night while that vicious monster was sleeping upstairs. I had to gather all my primary hard drives and mix a highly volatile chemical compound in complete silence. If David caught me in the garage, he would confiscate my equipment and ruin the synthesis. If he locked me out before I could finish the new formula, the $200 million deal would collapse forever. Richard handed me a secure encrypted laptop to record the new data safely. Maya booked us on the next available red-eye flight back to Chicago. The clock was ticking down fast. I was about to commit a dangerous late-night burglary on my very own property, to secretly steal back my stolen future and finally destroy the man who tried to ruin my life. The cab dropped me off 2 blocks away from my own house. I dragged my suitcase along the cracked sidewalks, staying deep in the shadows. The neighborhood was perfectly still. It was 3 a.m. and a freezing fog hung over the lawns. My heart hammered against my ribs with every step. Maya had warned me that David was unpredictable, but seeing the yellow commercial dumpster in my driveway made my blood run cold. He had not waited 48 hours. He wanted my laboratory destroyed immediately out of pure spite. I crept up the concrete driveway, avoiding the bright motion sensor lights David installed last year. I left my suitcase hidden behind a large bush and slipped toward the side door of the detached garage. I reached out for the familiar brass doorknob, but my hand hit heavy steel instead. I pulled my phone out and used the dim screen to illuminate the wooden door. A massive industrial padlock was bolted straight through the wood frame. Taped just above the new lock was a brightly colored receipt from a rapid junk hauling service. The bold print stated clearly that the demolition crew would arrive at exactly 6 a.m. to gut the structure and haul everything to the city landfill. I checked the digital time on my phone screen. I had exactly 3 hours before angry men with sledgehammers destroyed 10 years of my life and a $200 million corporate future. Pure panic clawed at my throat, but I forced the terror down deep. I could not afford to fall apart right now. I had to get inside that dark room tonight, no matter what. I walked quietly around to the back of the detached garage, where a single narrow window faced the dark woods. David never checked this side of the building. He hated the thick mud and the overgrown thorny bushes. Years ago, the wooden frame around this specific glass pane had started to rot. I had asked him to fix it 6 times, but he always rudely said my hobby shed was not worth the repair cost. His arrogant negligence was about to save my entire life and my massive fortune. I found a flat, heavy rock near the concrete foundation and wedged it firmly under the wooden sash. I pushed upward with absolutely all my strength. The damp, swollen wood groaned loudly in the freezing night. I stopped pushing instantly and held my breath in sheer terror. I looked up at the second-story window of the main brick house. The master bedroom was completely dark. David was a very heavy sleeper, but the sharp sound of breaking wood would surely wake him. I shifted my body weight and pushed again using steady, even upward pressure. The rusted metal latch finally gave way with a sudden snap. The window slid up just enough for me to squeeze my shoulders through the opening. I hoisted myself up over the sill, scraping my stomach against the rough, splintered wood. I tumbled forward awkwardly and landed hard on the cold concrete floor of my laboratory. The quiet room smelled faintly of sterile rubbing alcohol and dried industrial polymers. It was the comforting smell of my only sanctuary. I stood up slowly, rubbing my bruised knee, and let my eyes adjust to the darkness. The pale moonlight filtered through the dirty window, casting long, eerie shadows across my wooden workbenches. All my glass beakers and custom centrifuges were still exactly where I left them yesterday. I walked quickly over to the main computer terminal hidden under a thick plastic dust cover. I reached around the back of the tower and unplugged my primary encrypted solid-state drive. That small heavy metal rectangle held a decade of exhausting trial and error. It held every single failed chemical attempt and every microscopic scientific breakthrough I ever made. I slipped it safely into the deep interior pocket of my heavy winter jacket. That was the easy step one. Step two was infinitely more dangerous and incredibly complicated. I pulled the secure encrypted laptop Richard had given me in New York from my bag and booted it up on the counter. The bright digital screen glowed with a harsh, blinding light. I quickly draped a dark, heavy towel over the monitor to hide the bright glare from the back window. I pulled my protective safety goggles down over my eyes and tied my long hair back tightly with a rubber band. I had to perfectly synthesize the altered molecular compound Maya and the corporate lawyers demanded for the new blind trust patent. I had to substitute the original carbon chain to create a completely new chemical entity, and I had to do it using only weak battery-powered emergency flashlights to avoid triggering the main electrical breaker, which David monitored strictly on his phone. I moved around the dark lab with frantic, quiet precision. I measured the highly volatile liquid compounds using thin glass pipettes. My bare hands shook slightly from the adrenaline as I transferred the highly acidic base into the large mixing beaker. One wrong microscopic drop or one badly miscalculated measurement would cause the unstable mixture to smoke rapidly and set off the commercial fire alarms wired directly to the main house. I watched the thick, viscous liquid swirl slowly in the glass container under the weak flashlight beam. It was slow, agonizing scientific work. I added the brand new synthetic binding agent drop by careful drop. I stared intensely at my glowing wristwatch as the seconds ticked away ruthlessly. It was 4:30 in the morning already. The complex chemical reaction required exactly 45 uninterrupted minutes to fully stabilize at normal room temperature. Every tiny creaking noise from the main house made my heart stop beating completely. The cold wind rattled the loose garage door, and I nearly dropped a glass vial of chemical activating agent on the hard floor. I stood perfectly still in the freezing dark room, watching the liquid slowly change from a thick milky white to a beautifully translucent amber color. That specific color shift meant the brand new molecular chain was binding together successfully. I was actually pulling it off against all odds. I was legally circumventing my abusive husband right under his sleeping nose. As the final 15 agonizing minutes dragged by slowly, I realized I urgently needed to leave a fake trail for David. He was too greedy to just throw away electronics. I dug out an old discarded hard drive from a storage bin. It was a corrupted backup I used 5 years ago. I quickly plugged it into my old lab computer and mocked up fake email drafts to imaginary amateur investors. I wrote desperate messages begging them to buy my formula for a meager $50,000. I made it look like I was a pathetic housewife on the verge of a tiny financial sale. I left the decoy drive sitting in the exact middle of my empty workbench, attached to a brightly colored red cord. David would eagerly steal the heavy drive, thinking he was taking my master copy and ruining my tiny victory. He would have absolutely no idea he was stealing useless garbage while I walked away with $200 million. I poured the freshly cured amber polymer into 3 sterile glass vials and sealed them tightly. I packed them safely into my canvas bag next to my real encrypted hard drive. Suddenly, a massive, heavy diesel engine roared aggressively at the end of our quiet street. The rapid junk-hauling crew was 10 minutes early. I heard heavy boots hitting the pavement and the loud metallic jingling of brass keys. The heavy padlock rattled violently against the front wooden door. I grabbed my bag and lunged toward the open back window. I scrambled frantically over the dirty sill just as the overhead lights snapped on brightly. I dropped to the freezing muddy ground outside and ran fast through the dense tree line, disappearing safely into the morning fog. I finally had everything I needed to destroy my husband forever. David stood quietly on the cold back patio, firmly holding a steaming ceramic mug of dark black coffee in his hands. He carefully watched the heavy diesel truck from the local junk removal company back very slowly down the long concrete driveway. It was 6 in the morning, and the freezing fog was just starting to lift off the frozen grass. He felt an immense sense of pride and power. He had officially filed the emergency separation papers yesterday afternoon. Now he was about to completely erase his wife and her pathetic delusions from his property forever. He pulled the thick, heavy brass key from his warm fleece jacket pocket and walked confidently toward the detached wooden garage. The three men from the removal crew stood waiting by the heavy wooden doors. David unlocked the massive industrial padlock and yanked the doors open with a dramatic flourish. The cold, sterile smell of the chemical laboratory spilled out into the morning air. He boldly stepped inside, completely ready to order the men to smash every glass beaker and haul the expensive centrifuge to the city landfill. But as he stepped past the first wooden workbench, something bright caught his eye. Sitting perfectly still, in the exact center of the table, was a thick, solid-state hard drive attached to a bright red cord. It was completely isolated and practically glowing in the dim morning light. David raised his hand and told the workman to wait outside for just 1 minute. He walked over and picked up the heavy metal rectangle. He knew Sarah guarded her digital data like it was military intelligence. Leaving her primary drive sitting out in the open was incredibly careless. It was the absolute proof that she had panicked and fled to New York empty-handed. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He realized he did not just want to destroy her laboratory anymore. He wanted to own her completely. He walked straight out of the garage and told the confused demolition crew to wait in their truck. He carried the heavy metal drive back into the warmth of the main house and went straight up the stairs to his home office. He sat down at his massive mahogany desk and plugged the bright red cord directly into his computer. The drive booted up instantly without requesting a single security password. David scoffed out loud at her glaring incompetence. He clicked open the main digital folder, expecting to find endless useless spreadsheets and boring chemical equations. Instead, he found a folder clearly labeled Confidential Investor Communications. His heart skipped a beat. He clicked the folder and found dozens of saved email drafts. They were frantic, desperate messages written by Sarah to various unknown venture capital firms. He leaned close to the monitor and read the most recent document dated just 2 days ago. It was a formal letter of intent from a small independent medical supply group offering a flat $50,000 buyout for the total rights to her medical adhesive. David sat back in his leather chair and let the number sink into his brain. $50,000. It was not life-changing wealth, but to a man consumed by greed and petty vengeance, it was free money. He thought about the thousands of dollars he had spent over the last 10 years funding her electricity and buying her laboratory equipment. He felt a fierce surge of entitlement. He convinced himself instantly that because he had provided the roof over her head and paid the utility bills, the formula rightfully belonged to him. He was the primary financier. She was just the hired help mixing chemicals in his garage. He stared at the screen and decided he was not going to let her have a single dime of that $50,000. David pulled out his phone and immediately called the supervisor of the junk removal company. He aggressively canceled the demolition order and told them to get off his property right now. He watched from the second-story window as the yellow diesel truck drove away down the quiet suburban street. He had safely secured the physical laboratory. Now he needed to secure the legal rights to the money. He knew he could not use his standard corporate legal team for this specific job. They were far too ethical and would ask far too many complicated questions about his sudden scientific expertise. He needed a lawyer who operated deep in the gray areas of intellectual property law. He needed someone hungry and completely ruthless. He opened his digital contact list and scrolled down to a name he had kept saved for emergencies. Marcus Thorne. Marcus was a highly aggressive patent attorney who had recently been investigated by the state bar for filing fraudulent corporate claims. He was exactly the kind of shady operator David needed to execute this blatant theft. David hit the call button and listened to the phone ring. Marcus answered with a gruff, suspicious tone. David did not waste time with pleasantries. He introduced himself and confidently declared that he had just finalized a revolutionary medical polymer in his private home laboratory. He told Marcus he needed to file an immediate provisional patent and lock down the intellectual property before a hostile third party tried to steal his life work. Marcus sounded skeptical at first. He asked David a few basic questions about the chemical composition and the required curing times. David simply kept the fake email drafts open on his monitor and read Sarah's exact technical terminology right off the glowing screen. He confidently recited the specific polymer chains and the projected manufacturing costs like he had studied them for a decade. He claimed he had hired his wife as a simple lab assistant, and she was now threatening to steal his brilliant invention out of spite during their divorce. Marcus laughed a harsh, knowing laugh. He told David that disgruntled spouses tried to steal intellectual property all the time. He promised he could file the provisional paperwork by noon and secure the entire formula under David's name exclusively, but Marcus demanded a massive retainer fee up front to rush the legal filings. David did not hesitate for a single second. He pulled out his wallet and read his credit card number over the phone. He authorized a $10,000 charge without blinking. He considered it a minor business investment to secure a guaranteed $50,000 payout. He hung up the phone and leaned back in his expensive chair. He looked at the bright red hard drive sitting on his desk and laughed out loud. He had successfully trapped his wife in New York with absolutely no money and no access to her primary data. He had filed the emergency separation papers to freeze her out of his accounts, and now he was legally claiming her only valuable asset as his own personal creation. He truly believed he was a tactical genius orchestrating a flawless corporate takeover. He had absolutely no idea that every single move he just made was perfectly anticipated by Maya. He did not know the emails were completely fabricated or that the drive contained a dangerously stolen compound. By aggressively attaching his legal name to the counterfeit formula and paying a shady lawyer to formally register the theft, David was blindly locking himself into the most devastating and inescapable trap imaginable. His overwhelming greed had blinded him completely to the incoming destruction. The heavy oak front door swung open and I walked into the main hallway of the house. The air inside felt stale and suffocating. I had only returned to pack the last of my personal clothing before moving into a secure apartment Maya had arranged. I kept my posture straight and my face completely neutral. I knew David was home. His expensive sports car was parked directly in the center of the driveway, blocking the path to the street. I heard his leather shoes tapping aggressively against the hardwood floor of the living room. He walked around the corner and stepped into the hallway, blocking my path to the staircase. He was wearing his favorite custom-tailored gray suit. His hair was perfectly styled, and his posture radiated an overwhelming toxic arrogance. He was holding a thick manila envelope in his right hand. He tapped the heavy package against his thigh like a weapon. He looked at me with a mixture of absolute disgust and profound triumph. He believed he held my entire future inside that envelope. He thought he had already stolen my life work and secured the $50,000 payout for himself. He thought I was crawling back home because my trip to New York was a massive failure. I stared right back at him without blinking. I did not show an ounce of fear. David walked slowly toward the massive marble kitchen island. He threw the heavy manila envelope onto the smooth stone surface. The loud smack echoed sharply through the quiet house. He crossed his arms over his chest and leaned back against the counter. He spoke with a cold, calculating cruelty. He announced that the envelope contained highly aggressive divorce papers prepared by his new legal team. He proudly declared that he was taking absolute ownership of the house and all the vehicles. He told me the documents specifically cited my chronic financial instability and my decade of unemployed delusion as the primary reasons for the separation. He smiled a very ugly smile and told me there was a zero alimony clause permanently woven into the agreement. He said he was not going to pay a single dime to support a failed amateur chemist for the rest of her miserable life. He demanded that I sign the papers immediately and vacate the property before sunset. He wanted to watch me break. He wanted me to fall to my knees and beg him for a second chance. He wanted me to cry and plead for a tiny fraction of the marital assets just to survive. He leaned forward and pushed a heavy silver pen across the marble island. He told me to sign away my pathetic life, or he would drag me through a brutal public court battle that would leave me drowning in legal debt forever. I stood completely still and looked down at the thick stack of legal documents. My heart started beating rapidly inside my chest, but it was not from panic. It was from pure, overwhelming adrenaline. Maya had warned me this exact moment would happen. She told me David would use his aggressive legal strategy to punish me and protect what he thought was his money. but by demanding a clean break with absolutely zero alimony and zero claim to my future assets, he was unknowingly handing me the greatest legal victory of my entire life. He was voluntarily severing his own financial connection to me right before the $200 million Apex Biotech buyout went entirely public. He was locking himself out of the fortune permanently. I reached out and picked up the heavy silver pen. The metal felt cold and powerful in my fingers. I did not let out a single sigh. I did not shed a single tear. I did not utter a single word of protest. I pulled the documents out of the envelope and laid them flat on the marble counter. I flipped directly to the last page. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my full legal name with smooth, deliberate strokes. I flipped to the financial forfeiture addendum and signed that page too. I initialed every single aggressive clause he had demanded. I agreed to lose the house. I agreed to zero alimony. I agreed to walk away with absolutely nothing from our marriage. I placed the pen down gently next to the massive stack of freshly signed papers. I looked up and met his eyes directly. David was staring at me in total silence. The smug, arrogant smile had completely vanished from his face. His jaw was clenched tight and his eyes darted nervously between my calm face and the signed documents. He had expected a screaming match. He had expected me to throw the pen across the room and threaten to hire my own lawyers to fight for the house. He expected a desperate woman terrified of poverty. Instead, I had surrendered completely without a single second of hesitation. I pushed the papers back across the island toward him. I told him I would have my remaining boxes out of the bedroom in 20 minutes. I turned my back on him and walked calmly up the stairs. I did not look back. I did not rush. I walked with the steady, unshakable confidence of a woman who just secured $250 million. David stood frozen in the kitchen alone. The silence in the house was suddenly deafening. He looked down at the signed divorce papers and felt a cold knot twist deep inside his stomach. He picked up the documents and stared at my perfectly steady signature. Something was incredibly wrong. The victory he had craved all morning suddenly felt hollow and highly dangerous. He knew my personality perfectly. He knew I was a fighter who defended my laboratory and my dignity for 10 years. Surrendering the house and accepting zero alimony without shedding a single tear was completely unnatural. It violated every logical rule of human behavior. He started pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor. His mind raced through a dozen different terrifying scenarios. Why did I not fight for the money? Why did I not care about being homeless? Why did I look so dangerously calm? He walked over to the large bay window and watched me carry my final cardboard box out to my waiting car. I did not look sad. I did not look defeated. I looked powerful. That terrified him more than anything else. His greed and his intense paranoia collided violently in his mind. He realized I was far too calm for a woman who had just lost her home, her husband, and her entire financial future. He concluded instantly that I must be hiding something massive. He thought about the $50,000 investor emails on the decoy hard drive. He wondered if there was another buyer. He wondered if Maya was secretly funding a different legal maneuver behind his back. The absolute certainty of his brilliant corporate takeover began to crumble into sharp pieces of anxiety. He could not let me walk away unmonitored. He needed to know exactly where I was going and exactly who I was meeting. He rushed over to his desk and grabbed his phone. He bypassed his shady patent lawyer and opened a hidden, encrypted contact file. He called a high-end private investigator he had used years ago to run aggressive background checks on his corporate rivals. The phone rang 3 times before a deep voice answered. David spoke quietly and urgently. He gave the investigator my full name and my license plate number. He demanded 24-hour physical surveillance starting right this exact second. He ordered the investigator to follow my car document, every single location I visited, and photograph every single person I spoke to. He authorized a massive unlimited daily budget for the operation. He hung up the phone and stared out the window as my car pulled away down the street. He gripped the signed divorce papers tightly in his hand, crushing the edges of the paper. He thought he had won the war this morning, but the terrifying silence of my departure proved the real battle was just beginning. He was going to find out my secret no matter what it cost. The gray sedan stayed exactly 3 car lengths behind me on the interstate. I did not notice the private investigator at first. My mind was completely focused on the massive corporate maneuver I was about to execute. The investigator was a ghost in the traffic. He followed me off the highway and deep into the sprawling commercial district of the city. The buildings here were not small suburban offices. They were massive glass and steel complexes, surrounded by perfectly manicured lawns and high-security gates. I pulled my car into the sprawling circular driveway of a massive, vacant research facility. The investigator parked across the street behind a row of thick evergreen trees. He rolled down his tinted window and aimed a heavy telephoto camera lens directly at my vehicle. He watched through the glass as I stepped out of my car. I was not wearing my stained lab coat or my old suburban clothes. I was wearing a sharp-tailored black suit Maya had purchased for me. I stood tall and confident. Maya arrived 2 minutes later in her sleek black town car. She stepped out, looking like a corporate warlord, ready for a hostile takeover. She handed me a thick leather portfolio. It contained the final closing documents for the massive commercial property. We walked together up the wide concrete steps toward the towering glass doors of the facility. The morning sun reflected brightly off the beautiful structural glass. I took a deep breath. The massive moment was finally here. The private investigator snapped a rapid series of high-resolution photographs. He documented the massive scale of the building. He zoomed in on the large stone sign near the entrance that read Prime Commercial Research Space. He watched as the heavy glass doors opened from the inside. 3 men in expensive dark suits walked out to greet us. The investigator recognized one of the men immediately. It was Richard Sterling, the billionaire chief executive officer of Apex Biotech. The investigator pressed the camera shutter rapidly. He captured Richard shaking my hand with extreme respect. He captured Maya handing the thick leather portfolio to a senior commercial real estate broker. The broker reviewed the documents and smiled broadly. He pulled a massive set of silver keys from his pocket and placed them directly into my hand. The transaction was complete. I was officially the owner of a state-of-the-art chemical research facility, purchased entirely in cash through a blind corporate trust managed by my brilliant African-American sister-in-law. The investigator kept the camera perfectly steady as Richard signaled to his executive assistant. The assistant pulled a dark green bottle of vintage champagne from a small insulated cooler. He popped the cork and poured the sparkling liquid into tall crystal flutes. Richard handed a glass to me and raised his own glass in a celebratory toast. The investigator captured the exact moment I smiled and clinked my glass against the billionaire's glass. It was a picture of pure, undeniable wealth. It was a beautiful victory. The investigator lowered his camera and quickly connected the digital memory card to his laptop. He did not need to follow me any further. He had captured the holy grail of corporate surveillance. He rapidly compiled the high-resolution images into a secure encrypted file. He drafted a brief, urgent message detailing the massive scale of the commercial property and the confirmed presence of the Apex Biotech executives. He attached a rapid background check on Richard Sterling, highlighting his billionaire status and his recent corporate acquisitions. The investigator hit the send button and transmitted the entire data packet directly to David's private email address. He then put his car in drive and pulled away from the curb, entirely satisfied with his highly lucrative morning assignment. David was sitting in his home office, staring blankly at the wall. The house felt empty and unnerving. His phone buzzed sharply on the desk, breaking the heavy silence. He saw the encrypted email notification from his private investigator. He eagerly clicked the message open, expecting to see photographs of me crying in a cheap motel room or begging for a minimum wage job at a local pharmacy. He expected validation of his absolute superiority. The first high-resolution image loaded on his large monitor. David leaned forward and squinted at the screen. The air in his lungs vanished completely. He was staring at a massive multi-million-dollar commercial research facility. He felt dizzy. He could not believe his eyes. The reality was totally shocking. He felt completely terrified. He clicked to the next photograph. He saw me standing on the concrete steps looking incredibly powerful in a tailored suit. He saw Maya standing right next to me holding a thick stack of corporate documents. The blood drained completely from David's face. He clicked to the third photograph and his heart stopped beating entirely. He recognized Richard Sterling instantly. David read financial magazines obsessively. He knew exactly who the Apex Biotech billionaire was. And he knew that men like Richard did not waste their time on meager $50,000 transactions. They dealt exclusively in hundreds of millions. David clicked frantically to the final photograph. The image of me holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne, smiling and toasting with a billionaire, shattered his entire reality. His mind struggled to process the devastating visual evidence. He looked back at the red decoy hard drive sitting on his desk. The fabricated investor emails he had read yesterday flashed through his memory. $50,000. It was a complete lie. It was a pathetic distraction designed to keep him blind and greedy. He realized with absolute horrifying clarity that the medical adhesive was not a minor suburban science project. It was a massive revolutionary breakthrough worth an unimaginable fortune, and he had just voluntarily signed away his entire legal right to it. The intense panic hit him like a physical blow to the chest. He grabbed his hair and let out a raw, guttural scream that echoed through the empty house. He was completely ruined. He had been completely outsmarted. Maya had orchestrated the airport confrontation to force the legal separation. I had surrendered the house and accepted the zero alimony clause without a fight because I was already securing a massive corporate empire in secret. He had literally handed me the exact legal freedom I needed to keep every single penny of the massive Apex Biotech buyout. The sheer scale of his massive mistake threatened to crush his sanity. The fortune was slipping through his fingers rapidly. He had to stop the legal machinery he had arrogantly set into motion yesterday morning. He snatched his cell phone from the desk and dialed his aggressive divorce attorney. His hands shook violently as he listened to the endless ringing. The attorney finally answered with a calm professional greeting. David screamed into the phone. He ordered the lawyer to completely halt the divorce proceedings immediately. He demanded that the signed papers be shredded and burned before they reached the county courthouse. He frantically explained that he had made a massive catastrophic error in the financial discovery phase. He claimed his wife was secretly hiding a massive corporate fortune, and he needed to revoke his signature instantly to maintain his legal claim on the marital assets. The attorney spoke with a slow, crushing finality. He informed David that the signed documents had already been filed electronically. He was trapped forever. The financial world woke up to a massive earthquake on Tuesday morning. Apex Biotech released a joint statement to every major media outlet. The press release was titled, "A Revolutionary Leap in Modern Surgical Technology." The article completely dominated the front page of Forbes by 8 o'clock. It detailed the historic $200 million acquisition of a brand new rapidly curing biodegradable medical adhesive. The financial journalists praised the completely unknown female formulation chemist who had quietly engineered the miracle polymer inside her suburban garage. My name was suddenly printed in bold black ink across every digital business platform and local news channel. The articles detailed my relentless dedication and the extreme structural complexity of the newly patented compound. They called me a visionary pioneer in medical science. The media completely ignored the past 10 years of my quiet suburban misery and focused entirely on the massive astronomical buyout. It was the ultimate public validation. At that exact same moment, David was sitting in his corner office at his high-end financial firm. He was aggressively stirring his morning coffee and trying to ignore the gnawing panic in his stomach over the surveillance photographs. His desk phone rang loudly, then his personal cell phone buzzed. Then his corporate email alerts started pinging rapidly. A junior associate knocked on his heavy glass door and barged in without waiting for an answer. The young man was holding a tablet displaying the live Forbes homepage. He asked David if the billionaire chemist on the screen was his wife. David snatched the tablet from the associate's hands. His eyes locked onto a high-resolution photograph of me standing proudly next to Richard Sterling. The bold headline screamed $200 million cash acquisition. The number hit David like a physical punch to the throat. $200 million. He read the number over and over again until the zeros blurred together. His heart pounded violently against his ribs. The $50,000 decoy hard drive sitting on his desk at home was a complete joke. He had literally thrown a $200 million fortune into the kitchen trash can just 4 days ago. He had called my life work expensive garbage. He had served me divorce papers to protect his own pathetic bank account. The crushing realization of his monumental stupidity paralyzed him completely. The junior associate stood nervously in the doorway asking if David was going to be sick. David dropped the expensive tablet onto his desk. The glass screen cracked straight down the middle. He did not say a word to his coworker. He just grabbed his car keys and sprinted out of the corporate office. He pushed past his colleagues and ran to the parking garage. The sheer panic in his mind rapidly morphed into a blinding, toxic rage. His extreme arrogance refused to accept defeat. As he tore his sports car out of the parking structure and sped down the busy city streets, his mind began to fiercely rewrite reality. He convinced himself the fortune rightfully belonged to him. He was the one who paid the mortgage on the house where the laboratory was built. He paid the massive electric bills required to run my centrifuges. He had funded my entire existence for 10 straight years. In his twisted, delusional mind, I was nothing but a hired lab assistant who had stolen his corporate asset. He ignored the harsh reality that he had legally separated our finances and permanently forfeited all his rights just days earlier. He ignored that he had filed a fraudulent patent on a decoy formula. He solely focused on the blinding sum of $200 million. He gripped the leather steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned completely white. He listened to the local business radio station broadcasting live from the Apex Biotech corporate headquarters. The radio host announced that a major press conference was currently underway in the main plaza to formally introduce the new medical adhesive to the global market. David slammed his foot on the gas pedal. He was not going to let his pathetic housewife humiliate him on national television and steal his massive fortune. The outdoor plaza in front of the Apex Biotech Tower was packed with financial reporters and industry photographers. An elevated stage was set up directly in front of the sweeping glass doors. I stood behind a sleek modern podium. I was wearing a sharp dark blue suit and looking out at the flashing cameras. Richard Sterling stood to my right, beaming with corporate pride. Maya stood to my left, looking like an absolute legal titan. She constantly scanned the dense crowd with her sharp, predatory eyes. The atmosphere was incredibly electric. Richard stepped up to the microphone and proudly declared that my new patented formula would completely eradicate the need for invasive internal sutures. He told the global audience that Apex Biotech was honored to fund the next generation of medical innovation. The crowd of journalists erupted into loud applause. I smiled and stepped forward to answer the first wave of technical questions. I felt an overwhelming sense of profound freedom. I was finally speaking directly to the world about my life work, without my husband mocking me from the corner of the room. The cameras flashed endlessly, capturing my corporate victory. But the beautiful, triumphant moment was abruptly shattered by a violent commotion at the very back of the plaza. A loud, angry voice echoed over the heads of the seated reporters. David was aggressively shoving his way through the dense crowd of media professionals. He knocked a heavy television camera completely off its tripod. He ignored the shouts of the angry cameramen and stormed directly toward the elevated stage. His tailored suit was wrinkled and his face was flushed bright red with pure rage. The security guards quickly moved to intercept him, but David was fueled by a manic adrenaline. He vaulted over the front row of folding chairs and lunged aggressively onto the stage before anyone could physically restrain him. The entire plaza went dead silent in absolute shock. Maya instantly stepped in front of me to block his path, but David did not attack me. He aggressively shoved Richard Sterling out of the way and violently grabbed the main microphone directly from the heavy stand. The audio system let out a massive piercing screech of static feedback that made the reporters cover their ears. David gripped the microphone tightly and stared frantically into the flashing lenses of the national media cameras. He was completely out of his mind. He screamed into the microphone with a desperate, terrifying intensity. He pointed a finger directly at me and declared to the world that I was a massive fraud. He told the shocked journalists he had personally funded the entire decade of research and that his deceitful wife was illegally selling stolen intellectual property. The reporters immediately started shouting questions and frantically typing the scandalous allegations into their laptops. 3 large guards forcefully tackled David to the stage floor, dragging him away as he continued to scream completely unhinged threats, but the massive PR damage was already done in seconds. The public accusation broadcasted live caused an immediate panic. The Apex Biotech stock price began to plummet violently in real time, as terrified investors dumped their shares fearing a massive intellectual property lawsuit. David had completely sabotaged the entire press event and crashed the buyer stock, all out of pure toxic entitlement. The heavy glass doors of the massive Apex Biotech corporate tower slammed shut violently, blocking out the frantic, aggressive shouts of the massive media mob outside. Two massive security guards forcefully dragged David by his arms across the highly polished granite floor of the main lobby. His incredibly expensive custom-tailored suit jacket was badly torn at the right shoulder, and he was breathing very heavily like a highly panicked, cornered animal. Maya walked right behind him with a look of pure lethal anger burning in her eyes. I walked beside her, trying desperately to maintain a completely calm and collected exterior, even though my heart was pounding violently against my ribs. Richard Sterling marched rapidly ahead of us, completely furious and totally red in the face. His massive company stock was actively plummeting by the minute because of the insane public spectacle David had just caused on live television. Richard aggressively bypassed the main elevators and swiped his electronic keycard on a highly secure ground floor conference room door. The guards threw David roughly into a heavy leather chair at the far end of a long glass table and immediately stepped outside to guard the door. The room fell completely silent, except for the harsh sound of David catching his breath. He looked around the pristine corporate boardroom, and a sick, arrogant smile slowly crept across his flushed face. He actually believed he was fully in control of the terrifying situation. Richard slammed both of his hands down hard onto the glass table and demanded to know exactly what David was trying to accomplish with his insane public stunt. He told David angrily that his totally unhinged behavior had already cost the giant biotech company tens of millions of dollars in lost market capitalization. David simply adjusted his badly torn suit jacket and leaned back comfortably in the heavy leather chair. He looked directly at the furious billionaire executive and spoke with a terrifying level of pure delusional confidence. He loudly declared that he was the absolute rightful creator and the sole financial backer of the entire medical adhesive project. He called me a rogue amateur lab assistant who had deceitfully stolen his brilliant life work in the middle of a very messy divorce. Maya laughed a cold, harsh, and incredibly dismissive laugh. She stepped confidently forward and told the furious executives that David was a desperate, pathetic liar who had zero scientific background and absolutely no valid legal claim to the contested intellectual property. She firmly reminded Richard that the newly synthesized formula was completely protected by a secure blind trust and thoroughly insulated from any marital assets. But David shook his head slowly from side to side. He reached deep into his inside jacket pocket and pulled out a thick folded stack of legal documents. He forcefully tossed the heavy packet onto the exact center of the long glass table with a very loud, arrogant smack. He told Richard confidently that Maya was completely wrong about everything. Richard hesitantly picked up the thick documents and his face went totally pale in an instant. It was an official legal receipt for a rapid provisional patent filing registered directly under David's full legal name. The startling document clearly claimed absolute complete ownership of the highly specific biodegradable polymer structure. David smiled a highly predatory and victorious smile. He proudly announced to the silent room that he had legally secured the original chemical formula several days ago, using a highly aggressive patent lawyer named Marcus Thorne. He falsely claimed he had found my completely unsecured master hard drive sitting completely out in the open in our home laboratory. He told the stunned corporate executives that he legally possessed all the original data files and the entire decade of my deeply documented research. My blood ran completely cold for a terrifying fraction of a second until I quickly realized exactly what he was actually talking about. He had stolen the brightly colored red decoy hard drive I intentionally left sitting alone on the workbench. He had taken the completely fake $50,000 investor emails and the highly corrupted backup files, and he had arrogantly filed a provisional patent on a completely counterfeit chemical formula. Maya quickly caught my eye and gave me a microscopic knowing nod. She knew exactly what incredibly stupid thing David had done, and she knew he had just walked right into our highly lethal legal trap. But Richard and his panicked corporate lawyers did not know absolutely anything about the secret decoy drive. They only saw a highly aggressive provisional patent officially filed by a volatile, angry husband who was currently destroying their public image on national news. David slowly stood up from his chair and placed both of his hands firmly on the cold glass table. He looked right at Richard and proudly issued a massive financial ultimatum. He demanded exactly $100 million wired immediately into his private offshore bank account by the end of the current business day. He promised that if the massive sum of money was successfully deposited, he would publicly retract his crazy statements and legally sign over his provisional patent completely quietly. But if they dared to refuse his massive demand, he promised to file a massive federal injunction by tomorrow morning. He threatened to legally tie the entire $200 million acquisition up in federal court for a full decade, actively preventing Apex Biotech from ever manufacturing a single drop of the revolutionary medical adhesive. The massive corporate boardroom immediately erupted into absolute chaos. The panicked Apex legal team started frantically shouting over each other while rapidly reviewing the provisional patent documents. Richard forcefully held up his hand, demanding total absolute silence in the room. He looked at me with a very deep and incredibly heavy disappointment. He told me strictly that his massive company absolutely refused to ever purchase highly contested intellectual property. Richard explained that the sudden terrifying emergence of a rival legal patent, even a highly suspicious one, represented an unacceptable level of corporate risk for his shareholders. He turned quickly to his lead corporate attorney and ordered an immediate total freeze on the entire acquisition timeline. The harsh words hit me like a massive physical blow to the chest. Richard formally announced that my massive $200 million payout was locked incredibly tight in a highly secure escrow account. Not a solitary penny would ever be released to my blind trust until the messy legal dispute was completely resolved forever. David let out a loud and incredibly triumphant laugh. He looked directly at me with absolute toxic victory shining brightly in his dark eyes. He thought he had successfully held the entire billionaire corporation hostage and forced me into total submission. He deeply believed he was walking away with half of my massive fortune just by filing a single fraudulent paper. But Richard was absolutely not finished speaking. The angry billionaire executive turned back to me and forcefully delivered a terrifying and unexpected ultimatum of his own. He firmly stated that Apex Biotech would not wait around for a lengthy, miserable court battle to resolve my messy personal problems. He gave me exactly 72 hours to legally prove that David's provisional patent was completely fraudulent. He sternly warned me that if I failed to provide absolute perfect proof of blatant fraud within exactly 3 days, the entire massive acquisition deal was permanently cancelled forever without any further discussion at all. Maya did not waste a single second after the disastrous boardroom meeting ended. We walked directly out of the Apex Biotech tower and stepped into her waiting town car. She immediately opened her secure laptop and declared absolute legal war on David. She told me we had exactly 72 hours to legally destroy him and save the $200 million acquisition. Maya mobilized her entire corporate litigation team with a single encrypted phone call. She ordered 5 junior partners to completely clear their schedules and focus entirely on burying David under an inescapable mountain of aggressive federal paperwork. Within 2 hours, Maya had successfully filed an emergency expedited discovery petition with the district court judge. Because David had publicly threatened to freeze a massive corporate buyout, the judge immediately granted Maya the absolute legal authority to aggressively subpoena every single digital communication David had sent or received over the last 10 years. The legal blitzkrieg struck David with a terrifying velocity. A team of federal process servers arrived simultaneously at David's corporate financial office and at his massive suburban home. They handed him thick stacks of heavy legal documents demanding immediate unrestricted access to his personal hard drives. They demanded his private cell phone records and his complete encrypted email history. At the exact same time, a second team of process servers kicked open the glass door of Marcus Thorne's shady legal practice. They formally served the corrupt patent attorney with aggressive subpoenas demanding every single scrap of communication he had shared with David regarding the fraudulent provisional patent. Marcus panicked instantly and immediately surrendered his entire digital database to save his own legal license. Maya rented a secure corporate war room in downtown Chicago and filled it entirely with whiteboards and massive digital monitors. She instructed her team of brilliant corporate lawyers to tear through the massive mountain of digital evidence looking for absolute proof of total scientific ignorance. They worked ruthlessly through the night, drinking terrible black coffee and highlighting thousands of printed documents. By Wednesday morning, Maya had successfully compiled an absolute masterpiece of legal destruction. She called me into the secure war room and pointed directly to a massive glowing screen on the wall. It was a rapid-fire sequence of panicked text messages David had sent to Marcus Thorne just days before filing the fraudulent provisional patent. Maya laughed a cold, terrifying laugh as she read the messages aloud. The digital evidence was absolutely damning. David had frantically asked his shady lawyer how to properly spell basic chemical terms. He misspelled the highly complex biodegradable polymer chains so badly that the digital spell check had flagged every single scientific word. He literally asked Marcus if a centrifuge was plugged into a standard wall outlet or if it required a special battery. In a deeply embarrassing email, David openly admitted he had absolutely no idea what temperature the adhesive required to cure properly. He had blindly copy-pasted my highly complex chemical formulas directly from the bright red decoy hard drive, but his absolute lack of basic scientific knowledge was permanently documented in his own desperate digital words. Maya proudly explained that these specific emails proved, beyond any reasonable doubt, that David was a massive fraud. He could not even spell the chemical compounds he boldly claimed to have single-handedly invented in his private laboratory. Maya packaged the incredibly embarrassing digital evidence into a massive legal brief. She legally served the devastating file directly to David and his totally incompetent lawyer. David was sitting completely alone in his empty suburban house when the massive encrypted legal file arrived in his inbox. He clicked open the heavy digital document and his heart completely stopped beating inside his chest. He stared at his own deeply pathetic text messages blown up in high-resolution graphics. He read the absolutely embarrassing emails where he completely failed to understand basic elementary chemistry. The absolute reality of his massive legal failure crushed his entire arrogant ego. He realized Maya was not just going to beat him in civil court. She was going to humiliate him globally. She was going to proudly present his total scientific ignorance to the billionaire executives at Apex Biotech and completely destroy his elite corporate reputation forever. He felt the massive, heavy walls closing in rapidly. The 72-hour deadline was violently ticking down, and his fake provisional patent was completely collapsing under the immense weight of Maya's aggressive legal assault. Marcus Thorne called David in an absolute panic and screamed into the phone. The shady lawyer violently accused David of completely ruining his legal career and abruptly officially resigned as his legal counsel. Marcus hung up the phone, leaving David totally abandoned and completely defenseless against Maya's massive legal army. The crushing intense pressure triggered a massive overwhelming wave of pure toxic desperation deep inside David's brain. He knew he could absolutely never prove he actually invented the highly complex medical adhesive. The digital emails completely destroyed his fake creator narrative forever. He realized his only possible remaining legal strategy was to somehow miraculously prove that I had voluntarily signed my absolute intellectual property rights completely over to him years ago. He frantically paced back and forth across his empty house. He violently rubbed his exhausted face trying to think of a brilliant escape plan. His extreme, overwhelming greed completely hijacked his rational mind. He walked quickly over to his massive wooden desk and pulled out a stack of blank, high-quality legal paper. He aggressively booted up his personal computer and opened a blank document file. He decided to commit a massive, totally fatal legal error out of pure, terrifying desperation. If he did not legally own the fake formula by creation, he would simply own it by a totally fabricated contractual agreement. David began aggressively typing a fake legal contract. He titled the fake document a Total Intellectual Property Transfer Agreement. He backdated the absolute top of the heavy page to exactly 5 years ago. He filled the highly fraudulent contract with aggressive legal jargon, stating that I had fully surrendered every single scientific patent and every single chemical formula I ever created directly to him in exchange for total, complete financial support. He printed the deeply fraudulent document and laid it completely flat on his smooth wooden desk. He pulled up an old scanned copy of my genuine signature on his bright computer monitor. He grabbed a heavy blue ink pen and carefully began to aggressively practice copying my highly specific handwriting on a scrap piece of white paper. He traced my exact signature over and over again until he felt totally confident in his absolute forgery. He then firmly pressed the heavy pen directly onto the bottom line of the backdated legal contract and perfectly forged my name. He proudly held the fake paper up to the light and smiled a deeply sick, arrogant smile. He actually believed this totally massive federal crime was his absolute brilliant salvation. He placed the incredibly dangerous forged document securely inside a heavy protective legal folder. He deeply convinced his highly delusional mind that no judge in the entire American judicial system would ever dare to question the absolute authenticity of the old paper contract. He had completely abandoned all basic logical reasoning and was now fully relying on a terrible, massive lie to violently steal a massive fortune. He completely ignored the terrifying reality that Maya was eagerly waiting for him today. The heavy digital clock on the wall of the secure corporate war room ticked down to exactly 9 in the morning. Maya adjusted her sharp black suit jacket and sat down aggressively behind the massive polished mahogany table. She opened her sleek silver laptop and initiated the secure high-definition video conference link. I sat completely silent in the heavy leather chair right next to her. My hands were folded tightly in my lap, and my heart was beating rapidly against my ribs. The massive high-resolution monitor on the wall flashed brightly, and David appeared on the screen. He was sitting inside a cheap rented office space because his shady patent lawyer had totally abandoned him yesterday. He was wearing his favorite expensive gray suit, but it looked deeply wrinkled and completely out of place in the incredibly depressing room. He looked exhausted and highly paranoid, but he still desperately tried to maintain his toxic, arrogant posture. A certified federal court reporter sat completely off camera, recording every single spoken word directly into the official legal transcript. Maya did not offer a single pleasantry or a basic morning greeting. She immediately leaned forward into the camera and coldly reminded David that he was officially under oath and actively subject to the absolute highest federal penalties for perjury. David smirked a highly toxic and arrogant smirk and told her to just get the process over with right now. He totally believed his newly forged contract was going to save his entire life and completely destroy my massive corporate future. Maya started the aggressive, brutal deposition by forcefully establishing the absolute legal baseline. She completely ignored his massive, arrogant attitude and simply asked him to clearly state his full legal name and his primary residential address for the official court record. David answered with a highly bored and totally dismissive tone. Maya immediately went on the highly aggressive legal offensive. She reached into her thick leather briefcase and pulled out a heavy printed photograph of the brightly colored red solid-state hard drive. She held the high-resolution image directly up to the bright camera lens. She forcefully asked David if he completely recognized the specific digital storage device in the photograph. David leaned into his monitor and smiled a deeply victorious smile. He proudly declared for the official legal record that it was his own personal master hard drive. He loudly stated that he had personally seized the red drive from our home laboratory on the exact morning of our sudden legal separation. Maya kept her face completely, totally neutral and incredibly terrifying. She asked him to clearly confirm under absolute legal oath that the highly specific digital drive contained the exact complete chemical formula for the revolutionary, biodegradable medical adhesive currently being purchased by Apex Biotech. David did not hesitate for a single tiny second. He confidently declared, yes, absolutely. He loudly told the court reporter that the red drive contained his entire absolute life work and his own personal brilliant scientific creation. Maya slowly lowered the heavy photograph and stared completely directly into the bright camera lens. She told David that the digital files on that specific red hard drive were highly complex. She forcefully reminded him of the incredibly embarrassing text messages where he completely failed to correctly spell basic elementary chemistry terms just 2 days ago. She asked him how a totally incompetent financial executive who did not even know how to properly plug in a basic medical centrifuge could possibly invent a totally revolutionary chemical polymer. David instantly turned completely bright red with pure toxic anger. He violently slammed his fist down hard onto his cheap rented desk. He aggressively shouted into the camera that he was the absolute sole financial visionary and the total primary creator. He wildly claimed that the deeply embarrassing text messages were simply a minor temporary lapse in his memory because of the extreme high stress of the sudden messy divorce. Maya did not interrupt his totally unhinged, aggressive rant. She just let him continue to completely dig his own massive legal grave on the high-definition video feed. When he finally stopped aggressively screaming, Maya asked him a highly specific and completely lethal question. She asked him to officially swear under absolute penalty of federal perjury that he alone independently created the exact specific molecular chemical compound found on that bright red decoy hard drive. David stared directly into the camera lens and spoke with absolute total arrogance. He firmly swore under oath that he and he alone was the absolute sole independent creator of that exact specific chemical formula. I sat completely still in my chair and took a very deep breath. He had just officially legally tied himself totally directly to the deeply toxic stolen formula. But Maya was absolutely not finished destroying him today. She completely shifted her aggressive legal strategy and pulled out a thick, heavy legal folder. She calmly opened the heavy folder and removed a highly crisp, clear copy of the totally fraudulent, backdated contract David had aggressively forged last night. She held the fake contract directly up to the camera lens. She coldly asked David to officially explain the highly sudden and totally miraculous appearance of this brand new critical legal document. David smiled a deeply sick and incredibly arrogant smile. He proudly told the federal court reporter that he had simply misplaced the old legal contract in his highly messy home office files. He loudly declared that the ancient paper officially proved I had completely, voluntarily surrendered all of my absolute intellectual property rights directly over to him exactly 5 years ago. He wildly claimed the heavy document completely verified his absolute legal ownership of the medical adhesive and totally validated his incredibly shady provisional patent. Maya stared at the highly fake document and laughed a cold, terrifying, and incredibly dismissive laugh. She clearly asked David to officially swear under absolute strict federal oath that the legal contract was 100% genuine and completely authentic. She forcefully asked him to legally swear that he did not violently forge my personal signature on the bottom line last night in a fit of pure, terrifying desperation. David violently gripped the edges of his rented wooden desk. His highly toxic arrogance completely, totally blinded him to the massive lethal danger. He forcefully leaned directly into the camera and aggressively swore under absolute total oath that the backdated legal contract was completely physically real. He loudly swore that I had personally signed the heavy paper with my own hand exactly 5 years ago. He legally declared that the document was the absolute ultimate proof of his complete total victory. Maya instantly stopped asking aggressive questions. She completely froze her terrifying facial expression. A deeply heavy and totally lethal silence fell completely over the secure corporate war room. Maya slowly, calmly closed her heavy leather folder and placed it gently onto the massive polished mahogany table. She looked directly at the high-definition monitor and told David that she had absolutely zero further questions for him today. She legally, formally concluded the highly aggressive, brutal video deposition and aggressively terminated the digital connection. The massive screen on the wall instantly went totally, completely black. Maya slowly turned her chair and looked directly at me. A massive, incredibly victorious smile aggressively spread across her beautiful, sharp face. I let out a massive, heavy sigh of pure, total relief. We had completely, flawlessly executed the incredibly complex, dangerous plan. David truly, deeply believed he had just completely, totally won the massive legal war by aggressively lying under oath. He deeply, arrogantly believed he had successfully legally cornered me into completely, totally surrendering the massive $200 million fortune forever. But his extreme, highly toxic greed and his absolute total arrogance had completely blinded him to the absolute terrifying reality. By legally forcefully swearing under absolute strict federal oath that he personally, independently created the exact chemical formula found on the bright red decoy hard drive, he had permanently tied his own full legal name to it. By aggressively, legally swearing that the heavily forged contract was completely authentic, He had completely legally cemented his absolute full ownership of that specific digital data forever. He had completely unknowingly stepped entirely directly into the massive, highly lethal, incredibly destructive legal trap I had carefully secretly set in the freezing dark garage. He did not own the revolutionary medical adhesive. He completely, officially, legally owned a highly protected, massively stolen chemical compound belonging entirely to a deeply ruthless global multi-billion-dollar defense contractor. And he had just officially provided absolute, total, flawless video, recorded proof of his massive, incredible federal crime directly to a certified court reporter, ensuring his absolute and total permanent destruction. The heavy oak doors of the downtown arbitration center closed firmly behind me, sealing us inside the massive private hearing room. The atmosphere was incredibly suffocating and tense. A retired federal judge sat completely still at the head of a long polished mahogany table, reviewing the massive stack of legal documents Maya had aggressively filed. David sat directly across the room from me, looking like an absolute king. He wore a brand new custom-tailored black suit and a deeply toxic, arrogant smile. He kept proudly tapping his expensive silver pen against the hard table. He truly believed today was his absolute ultimate victory. He deeply believed he was about to formally crush me in open court and forcefully, legally seize my massive $200 million fortune. Maya sat calmly right next to me, holding a single thin file folder. She looked completely relaxed and incredibly dangerous. The judge banged his heavy wooden gavel loudly and formally called the high-stakes arbitration hearing to order. He instructed me to step forward and take the official witness stand. I walked slowly across the quiet room and sat down in the heavy leather chair. I raised my right hand and confidently swore under absolute federal oath to tell the complete, total truth. David aggressively leaned forward in his chair, eagerly waiting for me to violently break down and fiercely fight him for the fake red hard drive. He expected a massive, tearful, desperate legal battle. He expected me to violently beg the judge for mercy. Maya stood up slowly from her chair and walked confidently toward the center of the quiet room. She did not look at David at all. She looked directly at me and spoke with a completely flat and totally terrifying calm voice. She formally asked me to clearly state my absolute legal position regarding the provisional patent David had aggressively filed using the digital data from the bright red decoy hard drive. David eagerly gripped the edges of his heavy wooden table, completely ready to watch his new lawyer violently object to my testimony. But Maya did not attack his fake legal claim. Instead, I looked directly at the retired federal judge and spoke with absolute total clarity. I formally, legally conceded the entire red hard drive and everything totally, completely on it, directly over to David. I calmly testified under oath that I completely surrendered all my legal rights and all my absolute intellectual property claims to that highly specific chemical formula. The entire arbitration room went completely, totally dead silent. David stared at me in absolute total shock. His jaw literally dropped open. He looked frantically at the judge and then back at me, completely unable to process my massive sudden surrender. The retired judge looked highly confused, but he slowly nodded his head. He immediately struck his heavy wooden gavel and formally, officially awarded David complete, absolute, full ownership of the provisional patent and the entire red hard drive. David instantly erupted into a massive, toxic victory laugh. David aggressively slammed his hands down onto his table and loudly celebrated his massive, brilliant victory. He proudly shouted that he had completely, totally won the massive corporate war and finally, legally secured his $200 million fortune. He looked directly at me with a deeply sick look of pure, absolute, arrogant triumph. He told me I was completely, totally ruined forever. But I did not cry and I did not look defeated. I simply sat completely, perfectly still and smiled a very slow and incredibly dangerous smile directly back at him. Maya turned smoothly back to the confused federal judge. The judge asked her highly aggressively what else there was possibly left to discuss, since I had just completely voluntarily surrendered the entire primary marital asset. Maya calmly opened her single thin file folder and pulled out a brand new, highly secure corporate document. She formally handed the thick, heavy paper directly up to the judge. She told the quiet room that David had just officially legally won absolute full ownership of the specific chemical formula located exclusively on the bright red hard drive. But she then proudly legally declared that the highly specific formula located on that red drive was absolutely not my revolutionary biodegradable medical adhesive. David instantly stopped laughing completely. His highly toxic, arrogant smile totally vanished from his flushed face in a tiny fraction of a second. He stared at Maya with a deeply terrified and highly panicked confusion violently washing over his eyes. I leaned directly forward into the microphone and legally, formally dropped the massive, incredibly destructive truth directly onto his completely fragile ego. I calmly testified under absolute oath that the digital files he violently stole from the dark garage were nothing but a highly dangerous fake decoy. I clearly explained that the massive $200 million buyout from Apex Biotech was absolutely, completely dependent on a totally brand newly synthesized chemical variation. Maya proudly, forcefully presented the absolutely real massive patent to the judge. She legally proved that the entirely new medical adhesive was officially physically formulated and fully legally patented hours after David had aggressively filed his highly petty emergency separation papers. She legally, formally demonstrated that the true highly valuable formula was totally, securely, legally held inside my completely impenetrable blind corporate trust. The judge intensely reviewed the heavy certified legal timestamps and slowly nodded his head in absolute complete agreement. He formally, legally ruled that the massive Apex Biotech buyout was completely, totally immune from any of David's pathetic marital claims. The massive fortune was 100% totally legally mine forever. David was completely, totally, violently paralyzed by the massive, devastating revelation. He violently realized he had just aggressively, fiercely, legally fought to the bitter end to win absolute full ownership of a completely, totally useless fake formula. He realized his incredibly massive, brilliant corporate takeover was a totally complete, massive, highly embarrassing failure that completely destroyed him forever. David surged out of his chair, his face a mask of purple rage and absolute confusion. He screamed that the formulas were identical, that he had copied the data byte for byte, and that I was trying to cheat him out of his rightful prize. The retired judge frowned and motioned for him to sit back down, but David was beyond all restraint. He shouted that he had verified the molecular weight and the curing speed himself. He claimed he had spent weeks studying the data on that red hard drive, and he knew exactly what was inside it. Maya waited for him to hit his peak volume of unhinged shouting. She did not raise her voice at all. She simply placed a thick black envelope on the table and slid it slowly across the mahogany surface toward the judge. She told the court that David was absolutely right about one thing. The decoy formula was indeed an exact one-to-one replica of a highly complex chemical compound. She waited for the room to fall completely silent before she dropped the final blow. She announced that the formula on that red hard drive was not a medical adhesive at all. It was the proprietary classified formula for a specialized heat-resistant exterior coating used exclusively on stealth military aircraft and next-generation ballistic missiles. It was the most closely guarded intellectual property of a ruthless multi-billion-dollar international defense contractor. The air vanished from the room. David stopped screaming instantly, his mouth hanging open in sheer terror. The judge peered down at the papers inside the black envelope, and his expression turned grim. Maya explained that the defense contractor had been tracking the digital footprint of that specific formula for over 3 years. They had been waiting for the exact moment someone arrogant enough and stupid enough to claim legal ownership of it emerged into the public record. David had spent the last 2 days aggressively screaming that he was the inventor. He had filed a fraudulent provisional patent claiming total rights to the stealth coding formula. He had signed legal documents asserting his full ownership of the stolen defense technology. Most importantly, he had just sworn under absolute federal oath in this very room that he independently created and perfected that exact chemical formula. He was not just holding a decoy patent anymore. He was officially holding the bag for massive corporate espionage and egregious international copyright infringement. The scale of his self-destruction was absolute. He had essentially walked into a federal courtroom and confessed to stealing classified military technology from a company that employed its own private intelligence agency and had a legal budget larger than most countries. David looked at me, and his eyes were wide and filled with a primal panic I had never seen before. He turned his head to look at Maya, but she just stared back with a look of cold professional indifference. He tried to speak, but only a strangled wheezing sound came out of his throat. He reached out to grab the judge's desk as if he were losing his balance, and the entire room was spinning out of control. He finally understood the trap. He realized that every single move he had made to steal my fortune had been designed to lead him directly to this moment of total annihilation. He had been so blinded by his own greed and his desire to see me humiliated that he had blindly sprinted into a legal minefield. The defense contractor did not care about our divorce. They did not care about his suburban house or his petty social ambitions. They only cared about protecting their military-grade technology, and they were now legally obligated to destroy anyone who claimed to have stolen it. David had literally signed his own arrest warrant and notarized it with his own stolen provisional patent. He was no longer just a bitter ex-husband. He was a primary target for a global corporate legal machine that never lost and never showed mercy. He slumped back into his chair, his skin turning a sickly shade of grey as the full weight of his catastrophic reality finally settled into his bones. The heavy double doors at the back of the arbitration room swung open with a slow and terrifying finality. Everyone in the room turned to watch as three individuals walked into the space. They were not court officials or minor legal clerks. They were high-level partners from the most feared defense litigation firm in the country. Their lead attorney wore a sharp charcoal suit and carried a thick leather briefcase that looked like a coffin for David's entire future. Maya stood up slowly from her seat and offered a slight nod of recognition. She had been secretly coordinating with these people for weeks. She had fed them every piece of evidence David had produced during his frantic attempt to steal my formula. She had waited for him to swear his lies under oath and document his theft in federal court. The lead attorney ignored David entirely and walked straight to the judge. He placed a massive stack of legal documents onto the table. He did not speak in whispers or hesitant tones. He announced in a voice that cut through the room like cold steel that his client was the rightful owner of the classified stealth technology David had just claimed to invent. He laid out the evidence of David's fraudulent patent filing and his explicit public claims of ownership. It was a flawless execution of total legal destruction. The lead attorney then turned toward David and walked slowly across the room. David remained frozen in his chair, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an exit that did not exist. The lawyer stopped right in front of him and reached into his briefcase. He pulled out a heavy document sealed with a red wax stamp. He dropped the lawsuit onto the table right in front of David. It was a $50 million claim for intellectual property theft and malicious intent to distribute classified defense technology. The dollar amount was so astronomical that it did not even register in David's panicked mind for several seconds. He stared at the paper as if it were written in a foreign language. The attorney began to list the charges in a calm and detached voice. He detailed the severity of violating federal defense secrets and the absolute certainty of a criminal referral to the Department of Justice. He explained that his client possessed full forensic logs showing exactly when David accessed the files and exactly what he did with the stolen information. David tried to stand up, but his legs betrayed him and he collapsed back into the leather chair. The life had drained out of his face completely, leaving him looking like a ghost of the man who had walked in here an hour ago believing he was a billionaire. The lawyer did not raise his voice, but his words were like a hammer striking an anvil. He explained that this was not a standard civil dispute. This was a war against an entity that operated on a global scale and had the resources to litigate for decades. He told David that they would be seizing every asset he currently held to satisfy the initial judgment. They would be placing liens on his bank accounts, his retirement funds, and every property he possessed. They would be aggressively garnishing his future wages for the rest of his natural life. Any attempt to hide assets or declare bankruptcy would be met with a separate criminal investigation into fraud and obstruction of justice. David finally understood that he had not won $200 million. He had won the most terrifying legal war a single human being could ever face. He was not going to be a wealthy innovator. He was going to be an indentured servant to a defense contractor that would monitor his bank account until he died. The attorney leaned in close and whispered that the potential for federal prison time for the espionage charges was very real and very imminent. David looked at me once, his eyes pleading for a scrap of mercy or a shred of recognition, but I just turned my gaze to the window. The onslaught was absolute, and it was exactly what he deserved. He was officially stripped of his pride, his money, and his freedom. He was broken beyond repair. The arbitration room doors swung open, and the heavy thud of them hitting the walls signaled the end of the world for David. He stumbled out into the tiled hallway like a man who had just been released from a burning building. His expensive suit was rumpled and damp with cold sweat. He looked like he had aged 20 years in the span of an hour. When he saw me walking out with Maya, he didn't try to run anymore. He didn't have the strength. He looked at the attorneys for the defense contractor who were still standing nearby, and then he looked at me. His legs finally gave way beneath him, and he collapsed onto the hard floor. He scrambled forward on his hands and knees, his movements jerky and desperate. He grabbed the hem of my coat with trembling fingers. I stopped walking and looked down at him. There was no pity in my heart, only a cold and hollow silence. He started to sob, and the sound was high and thin like a wounded animal. He begged me to help him pay the $50 million lawsuit. He pleaded with me to use my $200 million buyout from Apex Biotech to cover his mounting legal fees. He promised that if I saved him from federal prison, he would never bother me again. He claimed that we were still a team and that he loved me. He sobbed uncontrollably that he was only trying to protect our future. He said he did it all for us. I looked at him, clutching my coat, and saw the man who had mocked me at dinner parties for a decade. I saw the man who had thrown my life work into the garbage and called me a failure because he was too arrogant to understand the science I was doing. He wasn't a partner. He was a parasite who had finally run out of blood to suck. I gently but firmly pulled my coat from his grasp. Pauses. I stood there as he crawled toward my feet, his face stained with tears and humiliation. The security guards started to move in, but I held up a hand to stop them. I wanted him to see me one last time before I erased him from my life forever. I didn't yell at him. I didn't gloat or point out how pathetic he looked. I just spoke with a quiet and terrifying clarity that made him stop his sobbing for a brief second. I told him that our future had ended the moment he decided to betray me for money he didn't even earn. I told him that I was not his team and I was not his savior. He was a man who had gambled his life on greed and malice, and he had lost everything fair and square. The defense attorneys watched from a distance with cold professional amusement. They knew as well as I did that no amount of money could fix the legal trap he had sprung on himself. He looked up at me, his eyes red and desperate. He started to ramble about how hard he had worked at his firm and how he couldn't survive in a prison cell. He tried to grab my shoes, but I took a step back and let him fall forward onto the cold tile. The sight of him there, broken and bankrupt, was a strange kind of peace. All those years of being told I was useless and being treated like a second-class citizen in my own home had culminated in this final moment of total reversal. He thought he was the master of our universe, but he was just a small man with a hollow soul. He wasn't crying because he missed me or because he realized he was wrong. He was crying because he had lost his status and his comfort. He was a shell of a man who realized too late that the person he spent 10 years belittling was the only person who could have ever made him feel like a success. I looked at Maya, and she just nodded toward the exit. We turned away from him and started walking toward the sunlight pouring through the front lobby doors. Behind us, David remained on his knees in the hallway, sobbing and screaming for help that would never come. I didn't look back once. I walked out of that building and into a future where his name didn't exist. I was finally free. I looked down at the man kneeling on the cold marble tiles of the lobby. His custom suit was crumpled and stained with tears of absolute humiliation, and the arrogance that once defined his every move had completely collapsed into a state of utter panic. He was still desperately reaching out with trembling fingers, clutching at the hem of my coat as if I were his only anchor in a storm he had created himself. But I felt no pity, no mercy, and no lingering attachment. For an entire decade, he had used his icy indifference and cruel barbs to erode my confidence, treating me like a disposable accessory in the life he controlled. Now that very same cruelty had returned to dismantle him. I calmly opened my leather portfolio and pulled out a single document. It was the original divorce decree he had forced me to sign in our own kitchen back when he was smugly convinced he held the upper hand. I held the document out so he could see his own aggressive signature at the bottom. My voice was steady cold and utterly devoid of emotion as it echoed through the quiet lobby. I reminded him that he was the one who had insisted on this specific legal arrangement. He had demanded that neither party be entitled to the other's future assets, and he had insisted that neither side bear responsibility for the other's debts or liabilities. He had craved a clean break to protect what he mistakenly thought was his fortune. I told him that I was simply honoring the terms he had so arrogantly demanded. I was walking away as the sole owner of the massive fortune I had created, while he was left solely responsible for the crushing $50 million lawsuit and the criminal charges he had invited upon himself through his own greed. He stared at the paper, his eyes bloodshot and twitching. A hollow wheezing sound escaped his throat, a mixture of a sob and a scream of pure, unadulterated terror. He finally realized that the trap he had laid for me had snapped shut on his own throat. I placed the paper on the floor before him. I didn't care if he picked it up or left it behind. It was merely a monument to the most spectacular failure of his life. I looked at the man who had spent 10 years calling me useless and pathetic, and I realized I was looking at a stranger, a small hollow man who had built his fragile kingdom on bullying and entitlement. Now that his power had evaporated, he was nothing more than a broken figure on a lobby floor. He started to sob again, but the sound was thin and pathetic, quickly swallowed by the bustling activity of the building. I turned away from him and walked toward the glass exit doors without a moment of hesitation. I did not look back once. I did not offer a final word of comfort or a parting insult. He was already erased history. I stepped out of the arbitration center and into the brilliant afternoon sun. The air felt sharper and cleaner than it had in a decade. Before me lay a future where my intelligence was respected and my life was entirely my own, freed from the suffocating shadow of his presence. I left him behind in the cold, dim echoes of the lobby, beginning my new life with the quiet, unshakable confidence of a woman who had finally won her absolute freedom. The heavy glass doors of the arbitration center were still vibrating in their frames when my phone buzzed with an urgent notification. I pulled it from my pocket and saw a secure encrypted email from the lead corporate counsel at Apex Biotech. My hands did not tremble as I tapped the screen to open the message. The entire legal team had witnessed the absolute masterclass of strategy Maya had performed inside the hearing room. They had watched her methodically dismantle David's pathetic attempts at corporate espionage and expose his total lack of scientific merit. The board of directors had held an emergency session and voted unanimously to finalize the acquisition immediately. The message confirmed that the massive $200 million payment held in the secure escrow account was being released into my private blind trust, effective immediately. I watched the digital confirmation appear on my screen, verifying the transfer of the life-changing fortune. I handed the phone to Maya, and she read the email with a slow, satisfied smile. She did not look surprised at all. She had known this moment was inevitable since the very first day she looked at my adhesive formula. We stood for a moment on the crowded city sidewalk, surrounded by the noise of the afternoon traffic and the rushing pedestrians. We had been fighting a brutal war for days, and the sudden realization that we had actually won it completely left us breathless. We moved quickly to Maya's car and drove in silence through the heart of the city, until we reached her prestigious law firm located in a soaring downtown high-rise. We took the private elevator to the top floor and stepped into her expansive executive office. The walls were made of floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a breathtaking view of the entire metropolis glittering in the afternoon light. It was a space that commanded absolute respect and radiated total professional success. Maya walked straight to the mahogany bar in the corner and pulled out a bottle of vintage champagne she had kept hidden for a special occasion. She popped the cork with a clean, sharp sound that echoed against the high ceilings. She poured 2 tall crystal flutes and handed one to me. The amber liquid bubbled and caught the sunlight. We walked over to the glass wall and stood looking out over the city skyline. I felt the immense weight that had been crushing my chest for 10 long years finally dissolve into thin air. The misery of the garage, the fear of the lockout, the constant verbal abuse, and the nights of intense uncertainty were all officially over. I held my glass up and clinked it gently against Maya's. We stood in the quiet luxury of the office, watching the city pulse with life below us. It was a silent toast to the decade of hard work that finally paid off, and to the brilliant legal strategy that had turned my survival into an empire. We sat down in the plush leather chairs and started talking about the future for the first time without the dark cloud of David hovering over our words. I told Maya about my plans for the brand new research facility and the team of scientists I was planning to recruit to help me build my legacy. I spoke about the patents I wanted to file and the medical breakthroughs I was finally going to be free to pursue without any petty interference. Maya listened with intense focus, offering her sharp legal insight on how to structure my new corporate empire to ensure it remained permanently protected from anyone who might try to steal it. The fear that had defined my life for so long was completely replaced by an unshakable sense of power. I was not just a survivor of a toxic marriage anymore. I was a business owner, a pioneer in my field, and a woman with the resources to change the world. We laughed about the look on David's face when he realized his fake contract and his stolen hard drive had failed to stop us. We laughed until our eyes teared up at the absolute absurdity of his ego and the total disaster he had brought upon his own head. It was a cathartic release of everything we had been holding inside during the high-stakes legal battle. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of deep orange and purple, I realized that this was just the beginning of my new life. I had everything I ever wanted and the freedom to define my own success on my own terms. The $200 million was just a number on a screen, but the true value was the absolute control I had regained over my own destiny. I looked at Maya and thanked her for everything she had done. She had been the sword and the shield that kept me from being destroyed by a man who had dedicated his life to belittling my potential. She was more than just a sister-in-law. She was my partner in the most significant victory of my life. We finished our champagne and toasted one last time to the future. I knew that the road ahead would be filled with new challenges and new projects, but for the first time in my life, I was completely unafraid. I walked out of that office feeling taller and more confident than I ever thought possible. The city lights were starting to flicker on below us, each one representing a new possibility. My life was finally my own, and I was ready to start the most exciting chapter of my career. I walked into the elevator and watched the doors slide shut, leaving the past behind me forever. I was finally free, and I was finally home. The fall was as swift as it was absolute. It started with the legal seizure of the 4,000-square-foot house. A court-appointed marshal arrived on a Tuesday morning while David was still sleeping. They gave him exactly 1 hour to collect his personal items before changing the locks. He watched from the curb as a massive yellow truck pulled into the driveway to haul away the luxury furniture and the high-end electronics he had used to broadcast his status to the world. The neighbors watched from behind their curtains. People who had once praised his golf handicap and admired his car now refused to make eye contact as they walked their dogs past the chaos. David stood on the sidewalk, clutching a single cardboard box containing his clothes and a few sentimental trinkets. He had lost the house, the equity, and the social standing he had spent his entire adult life curating. The mortgage company claimed the property to cover the initial breach of contract costs, while the defense contractor began the long process of liquidating his remaining brokerage accounts. He was stripped of every symbol of the elite suburban life he loved so much. By the time he walked away from the house for the final time, he had already been scrubbed from the firm website, and his professional colleagues had stopped returning his calls. He was completely erased from the upper middle-class society he once believed was his birthright. The months that followed were a blur of humiliation and survival. David moved into a cramped studio apartment in a rundown part of the city. The walls were thin and painted a sickly shade of yellow. The neighborhood was loud and smelled of stale grease and industrial exhaust. He sold his expensive watch and his tailored suits just to pay the first month of rent and buy enough groceries to last the week. He no longer had a company car or an expense account. He had no status and no influence. Every morning he stood in front of his bathroom mirror and stared at a face that looked older and thinner than he remembered. He was a ghost haunting his own life. The defense contractor was unrelenting in their pursuit of the judgment. They did not settle for monthly payments. They sought every cent he earned. He was forced to apply for work at a sprawling warehouse on the edge of the industrial district. His past experience in high-level finance meant nothing there. He was hired as a floor worker, tasked with manual inventory and heavy lifting. He started the graveyard shift at 10 in the evening and worked through the quiet, dark hours until the sun began to rise. He spent his nights walking up and down rows of concrete aisles, counting boxes and scanning barcodes under harsh, flickering fluorescent lights. The work was brutal and repetitive. His hands became calloused and his back ached from lifting heavy crates. He was surrounded by people who did not know his name and certainly did not care about his former reputation. He was just a number on a clipboard. During his short lunch break, he sat in a sterile plastic chair and ate a cold sandwich from a vending machine. He would stare out at the parking lot watching the empty asphalt and the dark, empty sky. He had gone from the boardroom to the warehouse floor in less than a year. He was completely invisible now. The society he had obsessed over had moved on without him. He would see advertisements for luxury cars or upscale neighborhood events and feel a sharp pang of bitterness in his chest, but there was no one left to complain to. He was alone in his small studio listening to the siren of police cars and the distant hum of traffic. He had to account for every single dollar he spent. He had to walk to the bus stop in the rain because he could not afford to repair his old car. He had to swallow his pride every single day because he had no other option. He was a man defined by his greed and his cruelty, and in the end, those things had left him with absolutely nothing. He had wanted to erase me from his life, but instead, he had orchestrated his own total disappearance. Every night, he clocked into the warehouse feeling the heavy weight of his failure. He was living the exact life he had once ridiculed others for having. He was a cautionary tale living in the shadows of the world he once thought he owned. He was utterly ruined, and he had no one to blame but himself. The morning sun shone bright over the gleaming glass facade of my new research facility. The air was crisp and full of possibility. I stood at the entrance to the Jenkins Bennett Innovation Lab, feeling the weight of the last decade finally lift from my shoulders. A crowd of industry leaders, journalists, and family members gathered to watch the grand opening. I looked out at the sea of faces and saw only support and respect. Maya stood beside me wearing a proud smile that spoke of all the battles we had fought together. Behind us, a team of brilliant female scientists stood ready to start their work. They were the brightest minds in the industry, recruited from the top universities for their talent and their passion for discovery. I looked at each one of them and felt a surge of pride, knowing that we were building something truly special together. We were not just working in a lab, we were creating a future where our contributions would finally be recognized and celebrated. The facility was everything I had ever dreamed of and more. It was a space designed for innovation and collaboration where the only limit was the reach of our imaginations. I reached for the large ceremonial scissors and took a steady breath. The sound of the crowd faded away as I focused on the red ribbon stretched across the glass doors. I knew that this moment was not just about the building or the technology. It was about the path I had forged and the resilience I had cultivated to reach this point. I had been told that I was useless and that my work was garbage. I had been betrayed by the person I trusted most, but instead of letting those voices define me, I had used them as fuel to drive my own success. I cut the ribbon with a single smooth motion, and a burst of applause erupted from the crowd. The doors swung open to reveal the state-of-the-art laboratory waiting inside. It was clean and filled with cutting-edge equipment that we would use to change the world. I walked through the doors with my head held high and my confidence unshakable. I was the master of my own destiny and the architect of my own fortune. I was no longer a person who had to justify her space in the world. I was a pioneer. I walked to the center of the main floor and looked around at the complex instrumentation and the clean white surfaces. Every detail of this facility was a reflection of my vision and my commitment to excellence. I felt a sense of peace knowing that I had built this empire with my own hands and my own mind. My wealth was a tool that would allow me to push the boundaries of science further than ever before. I looked back at the team of scientists who were already setting up their workstations and knew that we would accomplish things that were once thought impossible. We were a force of nature, and we were just getting started. The fear and the doubt that had once haunted my nights were gone, replaced by the clear and steady light of purpose. I was fully in control of my work and my future, and that was the greatest reward I could have ever asked for. I stepped up to the main terminal to log into the system and begin the first official project of the lab. My fingers moved across the keyboard with a steady rhythm that matched the beating of my heart. I was at home in this space. It was the place where I would bring my ideas to life and help advance the cause of medical innovation for years to come. I thought briefly of the life I had left behind and the man who had tried to destroy me, but those thoughts held no power over me now. They were distant memories of a life that no longer existed. I was focused entirely on the here and now and the incredible work that lay ahead. I turned to look at my team and saw the fire of ambition in their eyes as they prepared to change the world with me. We were an unstoppable team, and we were ready to make history. I took a deep breath and started the first sequence of the project. The lab hummed with the sound of activity and the promise of what was to come. I was proud of the journey I had taken, and I was ready for everything that the future held in store for us. The lab was a testament to the fact that no matter how hard they try to tear you down, you can always build yourself back up again stronger and more successful than ever before. I stood at the center of my empire and looked toward the horizon, feeling the full weight of my success and the thrill of the new beginning. Everything I had earned was mine to shape and mine to protect as I led my team into a future defined by our brilliance and our courage. The screen glowed with the data for our first experiment, and I began to work knowing that we were on the brink of greatness. Fade out.